Thank you so much for the opportunity to come share my work here with you all. I will talk about some of my work that is related to socio-economic status, a social construct that I suspect has some genetic consequences. So I like to look at larger patterns of variation in big genotype data sets. I started my PhD looking at larger patterns of genetic variation in the Netherlands in particular, which align with ancestry differences. More recently, I have been looking at the geographic patterns of genetic variation in the larger data sets and looking beyond ancestry, so what remains if you control for ancestry. And what I saw is that the geographic patterns that remained aligned strongly with social inequality. So social inequalities globally between countries are decreasing, but within countries they have been increasing, especially since the 1980s. For a variety of social and economic reasons, technology probably plays a role. Technological advancements allow companies to run more efficiently with fewer employees and make more money. And this study that we published recently suggests that genes may be playing a role in this as well. So I will give more details about these studies later on in the talk, but just to shortly summarize, we looked at regional differences for a lot of traits, and after controlling for ancestry, genes that were associated with educational attainment showed the strongest geographic clustering, the strongest regional differences compared to any other trait. And those regional differences were strongly in line with differences in socio-economic status. And so people, and at least part of this was driven by migration. People that leave poorer regions of the country, they carry more genes with them associated with a higher education than anyone else, or than the entire country on average, I mean. And this has increased those regional genetic differences throughout the past century. So these regional differences coincide with all kinds of factors. So genes differ between poor and rich, but also money and a lot of environmental influences that are associated with physical and mental health problems. So all these things cluster together, and it's important to find out how they cluster together and why these differences are growing. And that's what my talk is going to be about. But before we get into that, I think we have to first acknowledge the historical context of this type of research, which is at times controversial. So I will first start the talk with giving an overview of the history of the study of social stratification, and then gradually move on to the current state. So what is social stratification? It's human civilizations have, as long as we know, stratified their populations into different levels of socio-economic status. So different levels of power, prestige, wealth, health, freedom, and overall quality of life. There are no known civilizations to us that don't have social stratification, but it's not the defining characteristics of all human societies that we know. The hunter-gatherer societies that we know today are largely egalitarian. So we assume that they have been in the past as well, until 12,000 years ago, when the agricultural revolution occurred. Our basic dietary needs were easily met. This allowed us to for more people to survive, population sizes grew, cities formed, there was division of labor, job specialization, unequal accumulation of possessions. Social stratification became a key characteristic of human civilizations and took many different forms. Many of the mechanisms that I will be discussing later apply especially to so-called meritocratic systems, where your socioeconomic status is determined by your merit, your contributions to society. There is a certain level of social mobility, and the earliest recorded example of such a system was in ancient China in the 6th century BC, where Confucius advocated that those who govern should do so because of merit and not of inherited status. So until quite recently, we had the medieval estate system in Europe with the monarchy on top and the peasants below, and then that was came to an end at in the 17th century, where European Enlightenment scholars helped introduce the merit-based systems by translating Confucian texts. So the term meritocracy wasn't coined until 1958 by Michael Young in his fictional book, The Rise of Meritocracy, where meritocracy was not meant as a positive concept. His book is about a dystopian future society where aristocracy of birth turned into an aristocracy of talent, which is the new disenfranchised lower class, this time of the less merited. So this is a column from Michael Young, so the author of this book, where he did not like how meritocracy has become a positive concept. He says, "I have been sadly disappointed by my 1958 book, The Rise of Meritocracy. I coined a word which has gone into general circulation, especially in the United States, and most recently found a prominent place in the speeches of Mr. Blair." So if behaviors associated with merit, like intelligence and persistence, if those are heritable, then indeed an aristocracy of talent could turn into an aristocracy of birth. And the first law of behavioral genetics states that all human behavioral traits are heritable. So this brings us to genetics. As you all know probably, a trait is called heritable if individual differences are partly attributable to genetic differences. The development of the concept of heritability in the 16th century was actually based on legal concepts of inheritance and of property and wealth. The concept was further developed by people like Gregor Mendel and Charles Darwin and Francis Galton. Francis Galton is the cousin of Charles Darwin. He wrote this book in 1869 called Hereditary Genius, which was about socioeconomic success, basically. He applied statistics to show that offspring of eminent figures were more likely to succeed in high-profile professions. So this is a family tree of Galton, Darwin, and Wedgwood, which was a successful businessman. And he labeled people in the family here as normal, brilliant, scientific ability. So Francis Galton himself, he was an objectively very smart guy. He invented very basic statistical concepts that we still use to this day, like the correlation. But he also invented things that we are not so happy with anymore, like eugenics. Well, the concept did exist for longer. I think Plato also talked about it, improving the genetic quality of the population through selective parenthood. But Galton, he coined the term and he gave it the scientific allure that made eugenics widely supported across the world and across the political spectrum by established intellectuals and medical authorities. It became very mainstream. And eventually it led to state-sponsored violence on marginalized groups, to things like forced sterilizations, and reached even more horrible levels when the Nazis took it over in the Second World War. And one of the defenses of the Nazis in the Nuremberg trials was we were just applying the eugenics laws that were also existed in countries like the United States. So after the war, the popularity of eugenics declined. The science of heredity became decoupled from social applications like eugenics, and progressed through decades of twin studies. So in twin studies, you compare identical twins who are genetically identical with fraternal twins. And if for a trait, identical twins resemble each other more than the fraternal twins, then that suggests that the trait is heritable. And you pretty much observe that for every trait, especially behavioral traits that we looked at. The first twin study in the 1920s, I believe, was done on intelligence. Intelligence is, as you probably all know, one of the best, if not the best, predictor for socio-economic success, especially in this day and age, where intelligence is the best predictor for job performance and for educational attainment. So this figure is from a meta-analysis. Each dot here shows a correlation between family members that differ in how genetically similar they are, with the monozygotic, the identical twins on top here. And the more genetically, the more the family members were genetically related, the higher the correlation in intelligence, suggesting that intelligence is substantially heritable. So heritability it's a relative measure. It is the individual differences explained by genetic differences. So, but if there are more environmental influences that play a larger role, the heritability gets lower. So this study found that in families of lower SES, so poorer families, the heritability of intelligence was lower than in richer families. And they hypothesized that that is because in poorer families, there aren't enough resources to nourish the talents that can make children develop their intelligence, not as much as in richer families. So this was actually not replicated in Europe and Australia. I'm not sure if that is because there are different levels of inequalities between those societies or other reasons. So this study shows that as well, that heritability is a relative measure. It shows that it's a meta-analysis of twin studies on educational attainment, and in the beginning of last century, the heritability for females for educational attainment was almost zero. And that is probably because women did not have chance to nurture their talents through education at that time. And as the century progressed, more women were going to school and participating in the socio-economic system, and the heritability increased to almost 60% at the end of the century. Okay, so now we are in an age where we can actually measure the genetic variants and estimate their effects on these kind of traits. So this we do that in so-called genome-wide association studies. Socioeconomic status is usually measured with educational attainment or income. And these kinds of what we call complex traits are influenced by many, many genes with very small effects. And for those effects of the individual genetic variants to be detectable, you need incredibly large sample sizes. So the largest here is more than 1 million individuals, and the genetic effects that are captured explain about 10% of the individual differences. So these GWASs on educational attainment and income, they capture almost the same signal. The genetic correlation between those two is about 0.9, probably just capturing socioeconomic status, both of these. So what do these genetic effects mean? There's not a gene that directly influences educational attainment. These are genetic effects, many thousands of them, that travel through many levels of increasingly complicated biological processes that react to their environment. And basically, it's probably more of a bundle of different traits that we are capturing that are influenced by both genes and the environment that correlates with it. So one of the ways to get an idea of what kind of traits are bundled together in this signal is by computing genetic correlation. So if you take a GWAS for one trait and you compare it with the GWAS results of another, you can make an estimation of how strongly those genetic effects correlate. And so educational attainment and income, the genetic correlation between those two is about 0.9, but they correlate significantly with many psychiatric disorders, with things like personality, and of course, most strongly with intelligence. And some of the psychiatric genetic correlations are very interesting because they are positive. So a higher genetic risk for anorexia, bipolar disorder, or autism is associated with a higher genetic predisposition for higher education. So in this study, we took the genetic effects of intelligence from an intelligence GWAS and subtracted those from educational attainment. So then you have genetic effects on intelligence on the one side here, and then the rest, which we call non-cognitive skills. And if you then look at the genetic correlations with psychiatric traits, you see something interesting. For schizophrenia, for example, IQ actually shows a negative genetic correlation, but the non-cognitive skills show a positive genetic correlation. Same for bipolar disorder. So we're not sure exactly why this is, but one possible explanation could be that the genetic risk for schizophrenia and bipolar disorder are also associated with creativity. We published a study earlier where we had polygenic scores. Polygenic score is a measure for the genetic risk for schizophrenia and for bipolar disorder. And those predicted whether people had a creative job or not. So another way to get an idea of how these genetic effects, what they look like in society, is by looking at the geographic distribution, which we did in this study. So we had polygenic scores for more than 30 traits, the physical, mental health traits, things like cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, but also personality dimensions, cognitive ability, and of course, educational attainment. And so this Moran's I here is the measure for how strongly they cluster geographically. And what we saw was that when you control for ancestry differences, the strongest geographic clustering was observed for educational attainment. That was by far the strongest. And if you look at the geographic distribution, then those regional differences align with differences in socioeconomic status. And especially the coal mining regions versus the rest of the country were the clearest patterns. And that's because in Great Britain, between say the 1920s and 80s, the coal mining industry collapsed, and those regions struggled economically, high levels of joblessness, and people that migrated out of those regions, which is this light bar here, they have a higher polygenic score than everyone else in the country, especially the people that they left behind. And this caused a growing difference in those genes. So as I said before, these genetic effects on educational attainment are probably just a bundle of different traits that all influence your educational attainment. And so one way to get an idea of which traits those are is by computing the genetic correlation with educational attainment, which is on the y-axis here. And here is the geographic clustering. And we saw that the higher the genetic correlation with educational attainment, the stronger those regional differences were, with intelligence here showing the highest geographic clustering. And so educational attainment was about 0.6, so that would be all the way over here to the right. So educational attainment seems to pool all of these genes that are related with other traits geographically. And so as I said before, these genes cluster with environmental influences. So the genes associated with the lower educational attainment, they cluster in regions that have all kinds of other bad environmental influences. They have more fast food restaurants there, higher crime rates, more drugs, more higher joblessness, just more stress in general. And that creates what we call gene environment correlation. So those genes are then, they become correlated with environmental effects that influence all kinds of outcomes. So this is a good illustration of how those genetic and environmental effects become entangled with each other on a regional level. So these are, so by the way, all these results are from UK Biobank. So about 450,000 people from all over Great Britain. And here I predict, so let's just focus on height here. I predict the height phenotype, so actual height, with the polygenic scores for these 4 different traits. So those crosses here are the associations on an individual level. So on an individual level, the polygenic score for height explains about 20% of the individual differences in height, because height is very heritable, and the polygenic score for height is a very good polygenic score. The polygenic score for educational attainment explains only 1% of the individual differences in height, because educational attainment is not height. But it does show a bit of a genetic correlation with height. However, if we take the regional average of height and the regional average of the polygenic score, then suddenly the polygenic score for educational attainment does a much better job at predicting the regional differences in height than the polygenic score for height does. And that's because on a regional level, those genes that are associated with educational attainment, they cluster with all kinds of environmental effects that influence a lot of things, including height, but also BMI and overall health. And that kind of gene-environment correlation biases genome-wide association studies, which we investigated in this study, where we ran genome-wide association studies for more than 50 traits in UK Biobank, and then we controlled for geography. What we saw was that the heritability for educational attainment decreased, and for income and for intelligence, but not so much for the other traits. What did decrease for the other traits is their genetic correlation with educational attainment. So if you do most strongly for things like BMI, cardiovascular disease, and substance use. So this means if you do a GWAS on something like cardiovascular disease or BMI, and you don't control for geography, you get a signal of genes associated with educational attainment because those genes correlate with environmental influences that influence things like cardiovascular disease and substance use and BMI and mental and physical health in general. So this brings me to Darwin. They say nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. He wrote that nature selects adaptations that give organisms an advantage in the three struggles of life against physical environment, other species, and members of one's own species. Humans made great progress conquering the first two in the agricultural revolution, leaving the third, members of one's own species, losing the competition against other humans, makes society give you a lower SES, which means you get to live in a worse environment where there is a higher mortality rate. There's a higher disease risk in general, as we saw previously. Genes associated with educational attainment influence where you get to live, and that makes them associated with all kinds of detrimental outcomes. Even with things like infectious disease, like we see here. So in this analysis, what I did is something we call a regional GWAS. You do a GWAS on a regional measure. I just downloaded the regional reported cases of COVID-19 and the reported deaths. And I know where the UK Biobank participants live, so I just give every UK Biobank participant the COVID-19 rate of the entire region, and then I run a GWAS. Each dot here is one GWAS, and I did that for each day from March to June 2020. So this is the heritability captured by the GWAS. This is the genetic correlation with educational attainment. It goes from -1 to 1. So what I see is, in the beginning, the genetic correlation with educational attainment is positive because the first COVID-19 cases were in those rich regions, the touristic regions of London, where probably the virus came in. And then quickly it spread to the poorer regions of the country, causing a negative genetic correlation with educational attainment, and that remained like negative throughout the year. And then it has a bump here, became positive in December, around when that new variant came into the country, probably also through those touristic regions. And then quickly thereafter, the genetic correlation became negative again. The same pattern for the number of deaths. So if you have more deaths for a specific genes that are associated with a specific trait, that's would be a selection pressure, right? So COVID-19, of course, that's not likely to exert a strong selection pressure because it's most deadly for people that are way beyond the reproductive age. But previous more deadly pandemics, like the Black Death, smallpox, Spanish flu, they impacted lower classes more strongly as well. So we had more unhealthy living circumstances, which is not something that from recent times. They have always struggled with that, the lower classes. They suffer more from the pandemics, which occur regularly since the advent of agriculture and cities, when social stratification also became a big thing. So if social stratification targets the same traits over time, then this could impact the allele frequencies of genes associated with those traits. So natural selection occurs through differential reproductive rates, influenced by mortality rates, but more directly through fecundity or mate choice, the number of offspring. So evolution cares about which genes make it to the next generation. So number of offspring would be a more important measure for that than mortality rates. But peculiarly, so we looked at that in the UK Biobank. We associated all of these polygenic scores, the same ones, with the number of offspring. And we saw actually a negative correlation with number of offspring. So people with a higher polygenic score for educational attainment had fewer kids, which is the opposite direction that you would expect based on those mortality rates. Also, if you look at the genetic correlation with educational attainment for all of these polygenic scores, you see that also that is related to number of offspring. So a lot of these associations seem to be driven by educational attainment as well. But this was not uniform across the population. So associations between the educational attainment polygenic score and number of offspring was negative, especially in people, well, in mothers that had their first child at a younger age, younger than 22. In mothers that had their first child at an older age, this association is actually positive. But overall, the relationship is negative, and that seems to be a relatively recent phenomenon, because there are studies like this one that have looked at this relationship between wealth and number of offspring in pre-industrial societies, and saw that the wealthier left nearly twice as many offspring as the poorest. And this study looked at the same thing, but in more populations across the world and across a longer period from 1300 to today. And they saw that as fertility declined after the Industrial Revolution, there was a shift from a positive to a negative relationship. So possible explanations could have to do with child mortality rates that decreased, that used to impact the lower classes more. Women that have children at a later age because they get their education and participate in the socio-economic system, use of birth control. There are several explanations possible for this. So let's see, I was going to talk about assortative mating, but maybe out of respect for time, I will keep that part a bit shorter. So assortative mating is another mechanism through which genes and wealth can cluster in a population. So that's assortative mating happens when spouses resemble each other more. It also can influence genetic effect estimates in a genome-wide association studies. It makes them look stronger than they actually are. And assortative mating on socioeconomic status is strong. It's especially strong for educational attainment. We've already saw in these two studies that they were significant. This is a figure where we correlated the polygenic scores between spouses for 34,000 spouse pairs, and here also we saw that it's much stronger for educational attainment than for any other trait that we looked at. Yeah, so if spouses resemble each other more, then the differences between the offspring will also grow every generation, both in wealth and genetic makeup. So to conclude, the relationship between genes and socioeconomic status is complicated. It consists of a network of complex traits and environmental circumstances woven together by social and economic forces. Better understanding of this complex relationship can also improve our genetic association studies, not only on educational attainment and income, but for a wide variety of physical and mental health outcomes. So I think social stratification might be a dynamic selection pressure over longer periods of times, which seems to have reversed since the Industrial Revolution. SES-related migration and assortative mating could be involved in increasing social inequalities on both an economic and a genetic level, which would make them harder to overcome. I'm not sure how we should deal with this, or if we would have to deal with it at all without doing something that resembles eugenics. I would love to hear any ideas that anyone has about this complicated problem. And or if you have any other questions or comments, I hope that we still have some time for those. And thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much. So people can put in questions in the chat. Only I can see them, and I'll be selecting and reading out. Dr. Abdellaoui, we assume that evolution is selecting for higher intelligence and educational attainment, but isn't it selecting to maximize the middle of the bell-shaped curve by definition? Could this explain the negative correlation between education and number of children, etc.?
What do you mean exactly by that? That it's selecting for the middle? Well,
I can give a moment for I can give a moment for the person who asked the question to respond. In the meantime, while that's happening, another question: we make our own geography now. Could we accept that these apparent environmental differences are due to where people of higher intelligence tend to congregate?
Could you repeat that? We make our own geography, you said?
Yes, as in people move to where they go. And
yes.
And so could we accept that apparent environmental differences are due to where people of different levels of intelligence are congregating?
Okay, yeah. So people of higher, I think he or she means people with higher intelligence move to a region and they make it a better environment. I guess, yeah, that could be part of it. But also people that have more money are able to move to a region that's already good, that's already better. So I suppose probably both of those processes could play a role. Yeah.
All right. To extend on the first question, most genes are replicated in the middle of the curve. And so couldn't it be that evolution is selecting to maximize this middle of the bell-shaped curve where most genes are being replicated? Could that be the reason why we see a negative correlation between education and number of children?
Yeah, I don't understand how that would result in a negative correlation between educational attainment and number of children. I assume he or she means that there are more people in the middle of the bell curve. That it's because that's just how the bell curve looks. But I do not see how that would result in a negative correlation between educational attainment and number of offspring.
All right. When you found that assortative mating is strongest for educational attainment, did you check the percentage of couples that actually met in college?
No, we don't know where these couples met each other. But it's a good point. I think the geographic clustering, you are more likely to meet a spouse if you live closer to that person, and we know that these genes cluster geographically, so that could help induce assortative mating, and especially if you go to the same schools where the chances are higher that you end up in college if you have a higher polygenic score. So those circumstances could definitely be inducing assortative mating. And we are in a modern society, we are the more our education improves, the better we get, the more efficient we get at separating higher from lower polygenic scores, and that will also increase assortative mating, I suspect.
All right, thank you.